So we are not going to have on Wednesday because I have 2 interviews on Wednesday. I could actually give this class, but my other classes would miss it. So especially my last class, it misses the whole thing. And I like to keep my classes all on the same basis. So we're not going to have class on Wednesday. Wednesday was originally scheduled to be your midterm day anyway, so that's fine. Just take it as you do your midterm during that time, or take advantage to study your midterm. I'm still letting it be due on midnight on Wednesday. I'm not going to change that, but just don't come to class. I'm going to kind of do the fast speedo version of this lecture. We'll skip the videos. You guys are welcome to and should watch the videos. They're all on Canvas later, but we're going to go pretty quickly through here. Then next week, remember, is spring break. So basically, I'll see you today, then 2 weeks from today. And you have your second midterm due, Wednesday evening, I think. And you can do it during class. If you have any questions, email me. Take us, spring break is great, but also if you are behind, get caught up. Generally, people who come to class are not behind, so I'll do an announcement, remind everybody of this. So any questions? Remember, this chapter is not on your midterm, on the second midterm. This is chapter 11, so it's going to be on your final. Okay, so we're a little bit ahead, which is fine, because that way I don't worry about having to miss class next on Wednesday. So, okay, so we are going to talk about stress and health today. Stress, both real and perceived. What's the difference? Is there any difference if it's real or perceived? Not really. The thing about stress is it's to a large extent, it's about our psychological appraisal of situation. So if you think there's stress, it's stress. Okay, perception, that's individual subjective experience, plays a huge role. Stress, any non-specific response of the body and any demand made on it. We're going to see our textbook definition in a minute, which is a bit more complete as usual, but that's the essence of it right there. So the area of psychology that really corresponds to this chapter, or that this chapter corresponds to, is health psychology. Okay, this is about psychological and social variables and how they affect health and illness. Also about access to healthcare, etc., and how that affects health and so forth. And this is really an up-and-coming field in psychology. The last 10 years or so has really gotten a lot of attention, along with positive psychology. We've already talked about positive psychology several times. Okay, really focuses on the healthy psychological functioning, positive emotions, and resilient coping. Resilient coping, well, that's what coping with stress. I've got to change. This mask is driving me absolutely crazy today. I'm so done with masks. Change this one, which maybe a little bit better. Can't speak as well, but at least it's not squishing my ears. Okay. So like I said, really a lot of jobs coming out in academia and health psychology, because we're recognizing that, a long time ago, basically people thought that, your body, it was the physical part was the health. And that, people would often, if they couldn't identify a specific physical problem, it's all in your head, as if that didn't count. Now we know that actually our mental health goes hand in hand with our physical health. And stress, of course, is both mental and physical. It has repercussions on both. Health psychology focuses on how our physical activities, psychological traits, and social relationships affect our overall health and rate of illness. Really, health psychologists are interested in how everything that we experience affects our health. Our autoimmune system, our ability to fight off illness, our mental health, our physical health, everything, right? How do factors like poverty, wealth, religion, social support, personality, ethnicity affect health? How do they affect access to healthcare? Okay, responses to stress. How about cultural factors and stress response and coping? Okay, all these are important. So here's your textbook definition, always a little more wordy. Physical, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral responses to events that are appraised as threatening or challenging. Better is the one I already gave before, non-specific responses of the body to any demand made on it. Stressors are anything that cause stress, a stress reaction, right? Anything that causes you to adapt to something perceived as a threat or a challenge. And they can be anything. We're going to go into that in a minute. So there's good stress too, right? Distress is bad stress. That's just the effect of anything unpleasant, undesirable stressors. Eustress is good stress. Effect of positive events, optimal amount of stress that people need to promote health and well-being. So some stress is good. We need some stress to get us moving, right? Otherwise we would never do anything, right? Think about it physically. Muscles need to be stressed so they get stronger. To a certain extent, that's true psychologically too. We need a little stress to learn. There's very few people who don't need a little threat of impending doom to make them study properly. I know I'm not one of them.
That's pronounced eustress, right?
Eustress, yes. Eustress, distress and eustress. Sources of stress are kind of infinite, right? But we're going to go over some of the big ones. Catastrophes are the biggies. Unpredictable large-scale events that really force us to adapt in a big way and to adjust. Lots of threat. Okay, natural. What is going on with my phone? This is the second in a row. Natural disasters, man-made disasters. They test our ability to adapt. Humans are actually amazingly resilient. You know, I was in Oklahoma for 7 years and we got tornadoes. Tornadoes, classic catastrophe situation. Here we got earthquakes more, right? There's a lot of stress there. A lot of people do fall apart. But the amazing thing is how people come together and how people do. You know, they have their house, they lose everything, and yet they adapt, they adjust, and they build up from here. We have the fires. Fires are a natural disaster. I've had friends who've had twice their house has been burnt in the last like 10 years. It's ridiculous. Man-made disasters are like shootings, like Sacramento, okay, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, man-made disaster, okay? Catastrophes. Major life events, and everybody's got them. Job loss, death of someone you love, divorce, children, anything requiring big adjustments, okay, moving, okay, going off to college if you go, okay? They're gonna happen. They're stressors. We're gonna see a little bit about how stress is measured. You'll have an idea of how that affects us. Oops. Hassles. So hassles aren't considered like big stresses, but if there's enough of them, we all know hassles when it's just everything, you know, that no one thing is important, no one thing is big, but there are days when they're just over and over until you find your overall stress level is really high, right? So hassles also contribute to our stress, especially if we don't know how to ameliorate or lessen that our approach to them. And we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the biggest contributors to that perceived stress is controllability. When you do not have control, it's a stress, right? Things that we can control generally are not very stressful. Okay, they might be challenging and they might end up at moments of stress, but the less control you have, the greater the stress. Pressure, another important factor, produced by urgent demands, expectations from other people. Okay, there's a good chunk of pressure that is internal. Remember the importance of perception here? Sometimes you perceive a lot of pressure where there is nobody who's really putting it on, okay? The expectations of people you love, they don't mean it to be pressure, but they can be perceived as great pressure and can cause great stress, right?
That could be using motivation too, right?
Pressure is a motivation, so we'll talk about that. A certain amount of stress is good, right? Challenge is good. Go ahead.
There's been like life events that I felt overwhelmed amount of pressure, and like sure it led to like a couple breakdowns, but like I learned really fast and that's like never happened again. Like,
So yes, there are times stress is important, and especially with some people, if you don't have sufficient stress, you simply won't learn because we'll just kind of cruise along on easy, right? And let me just, I don't think I got you guys.
mistakes are the greatest teacher.
Yeah, let me Good. Who am I missing? All right, actually, all right, I guess I'm not gonna give you guys late things today, so. Okay, so, to you guys who came in late, wait a minute. We're not having class on Wednesday. Take that as a time to do your exam. I have interviews, I could do this class, but I couldn't, I'm missing my whole last class, and I don't like everybody to be unfair. I like everybody in my 3 classes to be as close as possible. That was supposed to be your midterm day anyway, so just do your second midterm there. Okay, moving on. Uncontrollability, remember learned helplessness, Martin Seligman and the dogs who were shocked and couldn't escape, and then once they could escape, they didn't jump out. Lack of control contributes to learned helplessness. Okay, because we believe if we just have repeated lack of control, then we tend to give up, right? Uncontrolled stress affects serotonin, resulting in clinical depression. Stress is just bad altogether. This is a depressing, stressful lecture because we're really gonna look at all the things that cause stress. But we're also gonna talk a little bit about how to overcome it, right? Frustration, it's just when you're blocked from doing something you wanna do, right? Frustration causes stress, it causes anger. Okay, possible reactions to frustration is aggression. Actions meant to harm or destroy.
In progress.
Displaced aggression is when you take it out on something that's not as threatening. So for example, you're frustrated at work because your boss is just being a real pain and is not allowing you to work tells you to do one thing, doesn't allow you to do it. Instead of being aggressive towards your boss, you get home and you snap at your children or your significant other, you yell at your dog, etc. That's displaced aggression. And when you look for an easier target, right? Not a good thing, does happen, right? Frustration, we hear all about how, violent video games contribute to aggression. The thing that contributes to aggression is frustration. So a lot of studies show that what gets people aggressive when they're playing games is that frustration, right? So it's a bad thing here too, contributes to a lot of stress. Another reaction to frustration is just escape, okay? Just avoiding the stressor. Okay, some of it is by self-medicating with drugs, such as alcohol or other drugs, right? That is escape. Just turning apathy, we just don't care. You stop caring, you just avoid the situation, you avoid think about it, right? Go ahead.
In terms of withdrawal, I've noticed somebody who kind of like a coping mechanism instead of like facing and solving the actual problem. They just kind of always avoided that.
Absolutely, that's escape withdrawal, and certainly weed is a big one. Alcohol, pretty much any drugs, drug abuse in general, but the most common one, of course, is alcohol. Weed is probably getting up there as it's becoming more and more legal. People tend to skip alcohol when they're thinking about drug abuse, but it's one of the most commonly abused drug when it comes to self-medicating precisely for escape from stressors, right? It's not a good thing. So another big cause of stress is conflict. And I'm not talking about like fighting with people. It's when there's 2 different goals and you got to decide between them because they're not compatible. You can't do both of them. And there's several different ones. These are all, like I said, and you can, these will be in your textbook too. But approach, that one you have to choose between 2 desired goals. You want 2 things and you can't do both, right? That causes stress. Decisions cause stress. This is the ultimate take home here. Avoidance, that's when you got to figure out the least of 2 evils, right? The lesser evil. You got to choose between 2 things you don't want to do, but you got to do them. Approach avoidance. Okay, that's when you have to choose a goal that has both negative and positive aspects. Choose or not choose it. Double approach avoidance conflict is when you have to decide between 2 goals that have both negative and positive aspects. This is pretty common. most of the time in life, we don't have pure good and pure evil, right? We don't have purely good and bad things to choose. We have to choose and weigh the positive and negative aspects between both of them. And remember when we talked about cognitive dissonance way back in chapter whatever, so when you made a decision or you've been forced to do something that you really wasn't your top choice, then after a while, you're going to start playing up the positive things of where you are and the decision you did make, and the one that you didn't make, you'll start forgetting the positive and playing up the negative just so you can be more happy with your current situation. This is one way which is pretty easy to do. Multiple approach avoidance, that's just the same thing with more. You have a lot of different goals, a lot of different things you got to get done, and they all have positive and negative aspects, and you got to decide where to which one to dedicate your resources to, because there's only so much of you to go around, right? There's only so many things you can do. All these things cause stress, the stress of decision making, right? And different forms of conflict. This is your little table. Again, remember, this is not, look, there's a random thing placed in the middle of that. This is not on this midterm, it's on your final exam. Okay, so we're not gonna do this. We're trying to jam this whole lecture in today. So this is if you go to these links later, it's a list of stressful life events that gives you a scale to gauge your stress. We're not gonna do that now, okay? We are gonna talk a little bit more about measuring stress. The social readjustment rating scale. This is just a whole list of life events and over the last year, and you're supposed to rate them to see how stressed you can feel, right? It's good, but it's very much targeting adults, people who are beyond study. I mean, we're all adults once you're in college, right? But with a later college undergraduate stress scale. This one kind of targets four-year institutions, but it's also good for community colleges. It's more apropos of where most of you guys are. So this is some examples from sample items from the social readjustment rating scale. Death of a spouse is like the biggest. And then you have all different things, even good things. You notice marriage 50, okay? Pregnancy, often considered a good thing, also very stressful, right? Mortgage, change in number of arguments with spouse. I love how that says change. So if they're suddenly fewer or suddenly greater. Yeah, I guess supposedly there's an ideal amount of arguments. I don't like arguing at all. I was watching my parents the other day and I thought they don't feel good if they're not arguing. It's very weird. Begin or end school, foreclosure, okay, change work, residence, okay, all these things are stressful. Christmas, vacation, okay? All these. So this is the college undergraduate one. If you want extra credit, I think a lot of you don't need it, but if you want to, you can have a look at it and then put your score for some points. Also, just so you can see what it's like. Okay, all right, I have a discussion. Let's move a discussion since we're changing this into one. We're gonna do our discussion now. Let me find it. Okay, so we're gonna do this discussion. What examples of good stress can you think of? What makes it stressful, and when does bad stress start getting involved? When does the bad outweigh the good? Okay, the example from the scale was Christmas. Well, there's, does the bad ever outweigh the good? When does it do? How do you deal with it? How do you deal with this kind of good stress, but also in general, how do you cope with stress? We have a very weird number. We have 5 in the class. So you guys are just gonna have to make one big gigantic de-stress circle. 5 minutes, talk about stress and techniques for helping yourselves when you get stressed. And you guys online, oh, Mark, I see you're here now. I'm gonna put you in a breakout room and you guys can talk about the same thing, okay? Pause the Zoom recording. Okay, right. Remember in chapter 2, we talked about the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic is the fight or flight, okay, responds to stress. The parasympathetic returns your body to normal balance, to normal functioning after the stress. All right, here is HPA axis, your classic diagram for the stress response. So basically what happens is a stressful event happens, your hypothalamus releases corticotropical releasing factor, corticotropin releasing factor, I don't even know how to pronounce that, signals the pituitary to signal the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Okay, cortisol you might have heard about, it influences the stress reaction. And it also provides negative feedback to the hypothalamus to say, hey, we need to stop being stressed, right? Maintaining high levels of cortisol is really unhealthy. That signifies that you're constantly under that stress, right? That signal to stop being stressed is not being listened to, or just more stressors happened, right? So this is what's going on in a very brief form in the brain. General adaptation syndrome is 3 stages of your physiological response to stress. They're alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. We're going to see a little bit more about them in a second. Hans Selye, I'm not even sure that's how you pronounce it, Hungarian endocrinologist, and endocrinologists study all the hormonal stuff going on, right? Endocrine glands, etc. He was the first to study the biological process of stress and really focus on it. And he was interested in the coping mechanisms that we can use to adapt to new situations and return to balance, to homeostasis. We talked about that before. Adaptation is just the changes you have to make to respond to a stressor. Homeostasis, we talked about it. I think this is like the 3rd time. Here's your textbook definition for this chapter. It's just to your balance, your steady state, your normal physiological state when you are more or less in balance, right? That's where you return to naturally if your body is allowed to process everything, stressful situations, and then return to normal. Resilience, very important. We talked about resilient, how some children are more resilient with different kind of, according to what their genetics, right? And resistant quality that permits you to recover quickly and thrive, okay? Being resilient means you're able to cope with stressors. Okay, this is what I normally have you watch this. Robert Sapolsky is a Stanford psychologist and professor talking about stress. It's worth watching. I suggest you do it, or do it when our class time on Wednesday, because otherwise we'd be watching it now. It takes a while. He talks about this modern society and how it's really causing us to have stress and to have the bad mental and physical health effects of stress. Why zebras don't get ulcers? So I always see that and think horses get ulcers, so why don't zebras anyway? His point is that a zebra sees a lion, has that stress response, runs away, and either doesn't make it and get eaten by the lion and therefore has no stress and no ulcers because it's now inside the lion, or the zebra gets away, runs away, realizes the lion's no longer pursuing them, puts its head back down and grazes, right? The stress is past because it's a concrete, acute stress response. What happens in modern life is that we have continual nonstop stressors. Okay, it's not the, seeing the saber-toothed tiger and either dealing with it or not, but it's just one thing after another, often low grade, maybe not life-threatening, mostly not life-threatening, but they don't go away. So we don't have that return to normal, right? So basically the argument that our modern day environment is contributing to a whole bunch of health problems because it's we did not evolve to deal with this kind of stress. Our HPA axis that I talked about, we evolved to have a high stress and then bounce back to homeostasis. That's not happening because of our modern day environment. So totally worth listening to, watching his thing. It's on Canvas as well under materials. I'm like, yeah, we talked about the general adaptation syndrome, alarm resistance and exhaustion. So you do need to be familiar with these terms. Alarm stage is just that flight or fight. When you see the saber-toothed tiger, okay? The zebra sees the lion and runs. So equines almost always run, right? Your resistance drops, your sympathetic system kicks in, you respond, etc. Resistance, okay, that's when you're fighting, right? You're still running away. You have that, you're fighting, you're dealing with the stress. Maybe you're studying like crazy because you procrastinated. Maybe you know, your parent is sick and you're there at the hospital with them and you're just enduring. You just keep using your resources until either the stress goes away, so the lion falls in the background, or you kill the saber-toothed tiger, or your resources run out. That's the part you don't want to happen. If your resources run out, you reach exhaustion, right? Exhaustion. No more physical resources, no more mental resources. You are no longer mentally or psychologically able to deal, to cope. You can't resist any longer. Okay, psychophysiological disorders may develop, not more. I need to fix that, may develop. Disease and death possible, right? And here's, this is from your textbook, I believe, an example. Firefighters under a lot of stress, right? Alarm stage, you're there, you're fighting, you're doing everything you can, you're tense, you higher blood pressure, higher heart rate. We talked about that sympathetic response in chapter 2, right? You have less blood in your digestive system, digestion slows and so forth. And if you do not stop, if you don't, you know, if your shift is not over or whatever, that's when you start really, you're exhausted, liver runs out of sugar, you're falling asleep, etc. So first responders have a lot of stress. Lots of nurses in my classes, and nursing is really hard, right? This is why nurses, maybe my sister-in-law is finally got her RN and she's working on weekends. Well, she has 3 days on, 4 days off. You must have that off time because otherwise it's too much. I told my brother, her husband, actually, they're both high stress profession. He's CHP. You know, it's a really difficult job, but boy, he has a lot of vacation. Why? Because they need that psychologically to deal, right? Okay. General adaptation syndrome, here's a graphical depiction, okay? We have the stage 1, okay? Alarm, you're fighting, then you're resisting. If the stressor does not go away, then you're exhausted. That is when your body is susceptible to attacks, right? Your immune system is not working properly because you're exhausted. Okay. Immune system just refers to everything in your body that fights off diseases, infections, and so forth. Now, you probably have heard this. I know it's talked about a lot in the news nowadays. It's negatively affected by stress. It's a psychoneuroimmunology. It's the study of psychological factors such as stress on the immune system. Okay. Positive effects on the immune system only work when stress is not continual and chronic. Chronic stress is disastrous for our ability to fight off disease, right? Oh, we got some. So what are some of the bad things that can happen? Heart disease, and we're going to see a little graph in a moment. Stress puts people at considerably higher risk for heart disease. We're going to relate that to personality in a minute. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes associated with excessive weight gain. Okay, you just have insulin resistance. Your pancreas is not producing enough levels. You're just resistant to them. It increases with stress. Type 1 diabetes is a completely different beast. Type 1 or juvenile diabetes, your body simply stops producing insulin. Type 1 diabetics must inject insulin. I don't know why your textbook doesn't mention it, but stress is terrible for them too because it messes up with the whole way that they metabolize things. So the insulin doesn't work the same. They have to change their response to carbohydrates changes. So diabetes in general just is really difficult to manage with stress. Stress makes really difficult to manage. Cancer, stress, did I hear a?
Are all diabetes hereditary?
They're both they are both hereditary. There's genetic component to both. I know more about type 1 because my brother has type 1. It's a gene environment interaction. There is a genetic component, but you also have to be exposed to a virus in the environment. They think, they know that there's a.
COVID, like,
That is a big speculation. In fact, my mother is really worried about my brother who has type 1 has 2 small children who are too young for vaccines. And my mother's been doing all the worrying that, oh, they shouldn't be exposed because it's a virus. And yes, there is evidence that there have been more type 1 cases. And so there's a lot of studies. By the time you're 3, you can do a blood test. They can generally see if you're going to be predisposed to develop type 1 diabetes. If you do not have, I don't remember what it is present, then you're probably not going to. But you can develop it all the way up into your 40s. I participate in a lot of studies. But yes, there is a genetic component to both. Type 2 as well, but I know it's completely different from type 1. So the fact that there's type 1 in my family means that we really don't have to worry about type 2.
Yeah. So my grandma has that. I don't know which type of diabetes she has, but I recently went to the doctors and I think my cholesterol went up like naturally. My vitamin D is a little lower. So I feel like that what you just said about how a virus could occur.
Yes.
Because I'm generally a pretty decently healthy person, but.
So vitamin D, low levels of vitamin D have been associated with increased risk of developing type 1 diabetes for sure. Low levels of vitamin D have been associated with increased risk of just about everything. So if you're low on vitamin D, take supplements and be out in the sun. Sun, your body naturally fabricates it if you are exposed to sunlight. But take vitamin D, people, it's a good thing. Yeah, and try not to be stressed. We're going to talk about techniques for de-stressing in a minute. So cancer and stress increases the malfunction of your natural killer cells. This means you are more likely to get cancer because your natural killer cells are not chomping on the bad cells, right? Okay, so here we can look, this is a good one. So on the y-axis, relative risk of a cold, so just a cold, your common coronavirus, not COVID, right? And according to duration of life stressor, so no stressor up to over, so you can see the likelihood of getting a cold increases tremendously the longer you're under stress. Stress and coronary heart disease. So all different causes of stress, including personality. Though they increase stress increases unhealthy behaviors and physiological reactions. So physiological reactions we've kind of talked about. Unhealthy behaviors are like self-medicating with drugs, and not eating too much, and not exercising, being angry and aggressive. That's bad for us. One of the best ways to deal with stress is to exercise. Anyone can tell if I'm not exercising enough because I get cranky. That's the way I deal. I go for a run. A lot of people are like that. Anyway, this is what's called a mediation model. Stress causes unhealthy behaviors and physiological reactions, which in turn make it more likely for you to have heart disease. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the psychological part of this. So cognitive factors, cognitive appraisal approach. This holds that how you think about a stressor, how you see it, that subjective perception, really matters when it comes to how that's going to affect you physiologically and emotionally. And this is Lazarus. We talked about him in the emotion chapter, which is chapter 9. Remember we talked about motivation and emotion? Our emotions result from our interpretations and explanations for a situation. Let's look at that here. So here you'll remember this, all these little snarling dog guys, right? Lazarus's cognitive mediational theory, really important when it comes to stress. So you have a stimulus, which could be threatening, but we have to appraise it first before we interpret it as threatening and have that response. So if the dog is snapping away and yapping behind a fence, you're good, but if it's loose, not tied up, then it's dangerous. You have that fear response and your bodily response, which is all that stress response. Okay, the response to appraisal of a threat. Fear is stress. So there's the cognitive appraisal has two steps. First, we simply evaluate it, a stressor, and decide if it's a threat or not, or a challenge. So a challenge is like a good stress, right? A threat or a challenge. That's the first step. The second step is actually evaluating whether or not we can cope, right? Your secondary appraisal is you're looking at the resources you have to deal with the stress, right? So maybe your primary appraisal is something like, for example, you learned that one of your parents has, some really bad illness and they're getting older and you have to deal with it. That first thing is this a threat? Is this a problem? Yes, it's a huge stressor. Secondary is, how can I deal with it? Okay. Do I have the money to pay for a caregiver? Do I have the time to caregive myself? Do I have a place in my house to take in my mother where she can live more comfortably, right? So that's that secondary bit. So if you have the time or the money or the space to cope with that parent who needs help, then the stressor, the stress is always going to be there, right? Because it's your parent, right? But it's much less. So that's where this is really important. So here's a nice little chart illustrating Lazarus's cognitive appraisal model. Okay, so we have, right up here, potential, the stressor happens. Is it a threat, right? Not a threat, fine, no stress, threat. Okay, then you have your biological emotional reactions, right? That's all going on at the same time. And you're doing your secondary appraisal, right? This is when it's important to have those coping mechanisms to actually slow yourself down, to focus on the problem and figure out if you have those, what to deal with it, right? Then you weigh your coping strategies. If you have enough resources, you use them and you're okay. If not, you just got stress, right? And it's an eternal cycle, which is why in today's world, it can be so difficult when the stresses keep coming. And through all of them, you're going through this, right? It probably is automatic to a large extent. But when these huge catastrophes happen, then it becomes vital, right? Okay, so I mentioned type A personality, stress and personality. And type A, ambitious, really focused, hardworking, has high expectations of themselves, high levels of hostility and anger, as well as being easily annoyed, okay? Type B, relaxed and laid back, okay? Less competitive, slow to anger. Type C is pleasant but repressed. So this is a person who appears not to be stressed, but actually is stressed inside, right? People who try to repress their emotions can't express them properly. And we're going to talk about how actually being in touch with our emotions is a good way of dealing with stress, helps us from getting too stressed. And hardy personality, those are those of us who are type A and everything, but we don't get as angry and hostile, okay? And I'm like a type AAA in some aspects. I like to be doing all the time. I don't tend to get angry about it, but if I did not have my coping mechanism of going for a run and stuff like that, I would be angry. So part of maybe the difference is, or at least very cranky. Coping helps those of us who tend to be really driven to deal with it in a proper way, so we can call it hardy, okay? Sense of control is really important. And you can really see the difference. Like my oldest is type B, has its own flaws, but he's probably not going to get heart disease, that's for sure. Okay, personality and coronary heart disease. So here we have the more driven, angry type A, and then type B, more relaxed. And we can see that the likelihood, okay, percentage of subjects, the type A, much more likely to have heart disease. These are all men. Men tend to be the type A angry, hostile part, just because of men tend to be more aggressive. Testosterone does that to you. Testosterone is not one of those useful things to have when it comes to stress, because it makes it more likely for an aggressive response to kick in. So explanatory style is really important. Explanatory style refers to how we explain what happens to us. So optimism and pessimism. Pessimists see, the classic glass is half empty, okay, versus glass half full optimist. Pessimists expect negative outcomes, optimists positive outcomes. Optimists have all sorts, the more positive your outlook on life, the more optimistic, the less likely you are to develop learned helplessness, you know, the dogs, the settlements, less likely to ignore their health, become depressed. So this book, The Optimism Bias, I read it the first year that I taught general psychology, which was 2012. So it is now an old book. I've left it on my PowerPoints because I enjoyed it so much. I don't even remember it anymore, but I leave it there because I thought at the time it was really worth reading, okay? It really shows that how it helps us both at an individual level, but also at a societal level to cultivate optimism, to cultivate the belief that we can control our environment. Because remember, we're talking about controllability and how when things aren't controlled, when you view things as not controllable, that's when you experience more stress. And pessimists tend to think they can't control things. Social factors, extremely, extremely important, okay? Social factors increasing effects of stress, poverty. Okay, so many studies show that financial hardship makes it really more difficult to learn, more difficult to do anything because of that mental stress, right? Job stress, culture shock, a lot of cultural conflicts. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Culture shock is I was an exchange student after high school. It's really great at the beginning and suddenly bam, everything is so different. That's culture shock, right? Burnout, negative changes in thoughts, emotions, and behavior as a result of prolonged stress or frustration. And burnout is very common with nursing professions. All the first responders have burnout. One of the biggest profession that's really likely to have more burnout is middle school teachers. Teaching, especially younger kids, is very, very stressful. Teachers don't get a lot of recognition or pay in a lot of states. In California, it's a little better. I came from Oklahoma, where I think like teachers maxed out at the starting pay for teachers in California. They really don't make enough, and so teachers move all the time. They leave Oklahoma because the pay is so bad and they burn out, right? If you have a stressful job and it's not paying you, so you have the poverty stress, yeah, it really, that's too much for a lot of people. Burnout is another very heavily studied topic in psychology. Okay, yeah, back to the culture. Acculturative stress, this results from the need to adapt to a new culture, a culture that's not your own, okay? A majority culture, if you move to a new country, it can even be moving to a new state, right? There's culture shocks at all levels. 4 methods of acculturation. Now, this is important when we're thinking about immigration or refugees who are given asylum, or just if you're forced to move because for kids, if your parents move you to a new country or a new school. Now, I happen to be in favor of moving your kids a lot. I move my kids a lot. I think it makes them really resilient, but you do have to acculturate. So integration is the ideal. This is when you maintain a sense of your original culture. You stay in touch with your home culture, and yet at the same time come to terms with your new culture and form a positive relationship with that new majority culture, right? Assimilation, that's when you give up your original cultural identity and adopt the majority culture altogether. People will talk about assimilating. This is less healthy, okay? Less healthy just because it tends to backfire at some point where people start thinking, hey, where did I come from? But it's better than other things. Separation, rejecting the majority culture's ways, and the worst is marginalization. That's when you lose ties, you don't maintain ties with your original culture, and yet don't form any new ties, so you really feel lost. A lot of the really bad outcomes happen with marginalized, and I'm sure you've heard this in the news. Marginalized people. Okay, so now the positive aspects, how to deal with stress. Coping strategies, so actions you take to ameliorate stress. There's 2 broad types. First is when you problem focus, when you try to eliminate the source of the stress. So you address the problem through direct actions. When this is possible, great, make it go away, perfect. Unfortunately, there's a lot of stressors that aren't gonna go away. And then you need to really do emotion-focused coping, when you need to change how you feel about a situation, right? Change your emotional response, or just recognize it and validate it and move on. Most stressors, it's good if you can do both, right? If you're not capable of, if your initial emotional reaction is really out of balance, is too much, you might be taking a stressor that is perfectly fixable, but you can't fix it because your emotions are all sideways, right? So maybe first you have to fix your emotions. You have to validate them, pay attention, and take care of them, and then you can advance to fixing the problem and eliminating the stressors. So most things we've got to address both things, right? There are things you can't go, you cannot avoid things like, your parents at some point are going to pass. You're going to have a job and support yourself. And you're going to have relationships which cause stress. There are good and bad stress, right? So some things it's just a matter of getting your emotions right. And we're going to go over that again. This is a nice little video on how to deal with stress, but I think we probably don't have time. It is on Canvas, so you can look at it. I have another thing I want to show you. Come on, go. Okay, coping. Okay, coping, balancing act between biological, psychological, and social processes. Again, the goal is adaptation, and these are just the three major areas of coping. Adaptive, okay? This is contributing to actually having the stress response go away. Maladaptive coping is strategies that cause further problems, like drinking, weed, okay? Yeah, it might relax you at the moment, but if you relaxes you so much you're not getting anything done, then that's gonna cause more problems and more stress, right? Escape is often withdrawal, escape, that might get you in that moment the peace you need. But if you don't re-engage, then you're just going to cause yourself more stress, right? Active coping, and that's just actively trying to fix it. Coping mechanisms are many. Some are good and some are bad. Meditation. So meditation, we get a whole bunch of meditation stuff. It's more and more popular. The whole thing is mental exercises to refocus your attention, that achieve a trance-like state of consciousness of relaxation. A lot of meditation nowadays isn't looking for that trance-like state. They're just looking to find balance, okay? Emotional balance very much. Some types of meditation, concentrated. You focus on some repetitive or unchanging stimulus so the mind can be cleared. That's like when you listen to music, okay? Oh, I just saw a thing on that binaural music that's supposed to bring you into like a trip or something. Anybody heard of that? People use it, I guess you listen to different things in each ear and the beats are a little different. That's used as a meditative device. It's called binaural. I probably am pronouncing that wrong. Anyway, they say there's like a tiny percentage of people who say that it causes them to have psychoactive somethings. Receptive meditation, that's when you're supposed to open your mind and become aware of everything around you, okay? You're supposed to have like a flow to expand your consciousness, to listen and smell and feel everything.
So like the hippie trope?
Yeah, I guess in some senses.
The 70s era?
They did all sorts of different meditations, yes. Yeah, probably more than that. Mindfulness is the one that's really popular now. Probably the one that's most studied as well. There's a lot of evidence that it actually is very psychologically beneficial for us to practice mindfulness. Whether or not you want to tie that on to meditation is not necessarily, it's not necessary, right? And it's a form of concentrated meditation when the person purposefully pays attention to the present moment without judgment or evaluation. So the idea is you actually, to be mindful means that you allow everything to come into your conscious awareness. You pay attention, you give everything due attention, you recognize all the issues, but you don't judge, okay? Without judgment means you're not judging yourself, you're not judging other people, you're just focusing on an issue, Okay, that's very, and you know, there's a lot of apps, there's a lot of help online that you can actually go and do this with people. And the research is encouraging. It shows that it is helpful, right? Okay, social support is really, really important. And the important thing about it actually is more, yes, it's important to have those people, network of family, okay, religion, friends, coworkers, everybody who you think you can turn to in need. And the important thing is what's important is that you think you have someone to turn to. Even if you never call upon your social support system, the belief that you have one is really important in being able to cope with stress, okay? Religiosity helps with stress. Most studies show it's because of its support system. Religion provides a support system, people you can talk to, okay, or you think you can talk to. Like I said, it's the perceived social support. It's the belief you've got someone who will help you. That's important. Some people vary in the extent to which they're actually likely to ask for help. But what is really the determining factor is the belief you've got someone if you need them, right? Cultural factors, cultures are different, coping strategies differ, right? Exercise. Now, I can't say this enough. There is no, no bad side to exercise unless you get really extreme and injure yourself, which, we do that sometimes. But basically, it's a win-win situation. It's good for your health, your physical and mental health. It strengthens your bones as long as it's some compressive force. Swimming does not do much for your bones, although a little bit because you make the muscles pull on it, right? Actually, weight training is good for your bones. It strengthens your bones. I already talked about the other day how it helps you burn more calories, and being overweight makes it more likely that you have type 2 diabetes and so forth, and die of COVID and all sorts of stuff. Exercise wards off viruses, etc. Reduces stress. Very good for stress. We're going to skip this. If you want to look at this, it's a cool little 10-day thing in the New Yorker. And I have one more PowerPoint I want to get to. This is another good one on stress. Again, if we had 2 full days of lecture, I would be exposing you to these videos. So I strongly encourage you to look at them at some point if you're interested. All right, let me get my other one. Any questions here before I go on my little stress? I have another little stress talk.
Are you gonna talk about PTSD, or is that only the video?
It's just a video. And it is cool. It's worth watching. Okay, so this is already on Canvas, so go and watch this. PTSD, this is really interesting. So people suffer PTSD very much. The same exact stressful situation will cause PTSD, unmanageable PTSD in some people and not in others. And it really has to do with their stress response and their coping mechanism, their resilience. So yeah, totally worth watching. PTSD is like the worst form of stress. Wait, well, no, I don't want that. I want this one.
I was in a relationship with someone with PTSD. It's very, very difficult.
Yes. And PTSD comes from a lot of different things. It's possibly one of, it's like the extreme form of not being able. PTSD is essentially the failure to cope with stress.
And
The failure to get past it and actually put it behind you.
do you have PTSD and not have anxiety and depression, or do you get like all of those as side effect of that?
That's a good question. I don't, I'm not a clinician. I don't know if everybody has, I know it's always different. I know that it's not something that happens necessarily right away. I have a friend who, he's a Vietnam vet. And he said, in those days you got home and you just got a family and, he didn't stop. He knows there were people who were shell-shocked and had PTSD. But he said he did not have PTSD until he retired. And suddenly he had time on his hands. He connected with other vets online, and suddenly they started to relive. He started to relive what he'd gone through, and that's when he had PTSD. So it's not like it's something linear, or it's going to happen, you can't say, okay, I've survived, so I'm never going to get it. It might come get you later. It's very complicated, and I think part of that is if you don't actually, like I said, be mindful, stop and look at those stressors. a lot of people who don't have PTSD at the beginning and develop it later on is because they never actually address the emotional aspect of that, because the physical stuff, you can be well physically, right? But that's the emotional stuff with PTSD that goes, and if you never acknowledge it, it's really complicated. So anyway, let me give you a few. This is another talk that I've started doing with COVID, and I'm just going to zoom through because we've already talked about this. Some thoughts on how to deal with stress. Okay, this is because Jill Mays from the Health Center talked to the faculty and as adjunct people and stuff, and gave us some ideas of how to deal with stress, and I like them so much that I've incorporated it. And what I like about it is this one: tend to your emotions. So I mentioned how, you know, that emotional aspect, that emotional response is something we really need to deal with. And part of dealing with it is actually recognizing that you have emotions. So those of us who are really driven, who are really busy, we tend to just like bowl through life, like one thing after another. You go home, you know, you get up, you do all this stuff. We never stop to notice how we're feeling until suddenly it is so big that we can't deal with it. And to avoid that crisis situation, it's in everybody's interest to actually, on a periodic basis, so like say once a week or something, pause, ask yourself, or once a week, or just when you feel like things are spiraling, how am I feeling? How is my mood? What is my mind focused on, and what can I do about it? Okay, really notice, label your emotions. A lot of studies shown that just labeling them helps, because that helps you know what's going on inside you. It's so easy for all of us to try to ignore ourselves, to just say, I don't have time to deal with this right now. Who said I don't have time to deal with this right now? Well, you will sooner or later. I certainly have. And you try to put it out, but that's not a good idea. You need to find time to pay attention, yeah?
What's the difference between feelings and
Mood? Mood is a longer term thing. Feelings are acute moments, right? Emotions are shorter lived, mood is long term. So in the course of one long mood, you can have a lot of different emotions. Mood we often define as either positive or negative. We're saying positive or negative affect is the term psychologists use. And so you can have a long-term positive or negative mood. And within that, you can have many different concrete specific emotions. So that's a really good question. And when I talk about noticing your emotions and labeling them, try to get the concrete, precise, specific emotions. They contribute to your mood, right? If you've got a whole bunch of negative emotions going on and they're never alleviated by positive emotions, that's going to result in long-term negative mood. We'll talk more about this when we get to chapter 14, which is psychological disorders. But that's a good question. When you're tending to your emotions, you're trying to be specific. So you're kind of ignoring your mood and really focusing on how you're feeling. Maybe you have to look back, and because you don't get a chance to tend to them until in the evening, you say, well, look back to the morning when you had a really bad reaction to someone, and then you usually feel bad about it, right? If you're me. Well, what were you feeling right then, right? Whose feelings are you absorbing? Sometimes it's not us, it's we're with someone who's really stressed and we're close to them and we're absorbing their own feelings, and we need to not do that. Because we can't be there for someone if all we do is absorb their negative feelings until they consume us, right? So notice if you're absorbing someone else's feelings, right? How is your stress showing? Are you being cranky, irritable, can't sleep? Are you eating too much? Are you eating too little? Okay, are you tempted to self-medicate? Okay. What is within my control and what is without it? What's it that God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and wisdom to know the difference, right? You need to know what you can deal, and how you can start gaining control over things that might be without it at that moment. Does it do any good to worry? If the answer is no, stop worrying. Like the Tom Petty song, most of the things I worry about never happen anyway. Yeah. Of course, I always think that's because you worried about them, so you avoided them, because that's me. But yeah, that's not the point. Consider, what do you need more of in your life right now? What do you need less of? Is there a way that you can actually get more of the things you need and avoid some of the things you don't need, right? Maybe you need less of listening to someone complain and absorbing their negative energy. You know, it's okay to tell someone, hey, I just can't hear this right now. You know, I want to support you, but let's focus on something positive to do, right? If you're absorbing too much negative energy. Just resources here, we're almost done. COS has a health center. They have a mental health self-screening. If you're feeling like you're about to come apart at the seams, this might just serve to show you that you're not, that actually there's a lot worse out there, but it's kind of fun and quick. This is what it looks like. Then they tell you what, you know, you get results and then you decide what to do with it. Resources, take advantage of it. Okay, quickly, activities that can help a day every week to check in with your emotional state. Okay, that's what I was talking about. Find time to actually pay attention to how you're feeling. Meditate, breathing exercises. I'm not a meditator. I just get too twitchy. I just either fall asleep or can't sit there. Other people have immense success with it. Okay, so what you can do depends on you. It's very individual. I think Mark online was mentioning how we cope is very individual, right? Exercise, do something creative. Keep a journal, writing, just writing down your list of emotions. You can have in your phone one of those little note things. I had a friend who did this. She said it was really successful. She had her students do it too. Just when you're feeling an emotion, write it down in your little notepad and then forget about it. Just leave it there, right? Leave it written down so you can move on, right? And later take your day a week, then you can take it out and think, okay, I'm gonna pay attention now. Regular meals and sleep hygiene, that can be so challenging, right? I am a night owl and I have a really bad habit of staying up too late and I still have to get up early, which results in a cranky, nasty Jessica because I'm not getting enough sleep. Try not to do that. I also forget to eat when I'm stressed. Don't forget to eat, and also don't sit there and eat 5 gallons of ice cream, right? Helping other people. It doesn't count if it's your children or your parents or someone you always help outside of your regular routine. Loads of research show that volunteering or simply helping someone cross the street makes us feel better. Physical touch, hugs. If you're not a touchy person, just, you know, be with someone and give positive feedback, right? This makes us feel better. Calm app, I still haven't tried this, but I always throw it out there. Joe mentioned it. Okay, so we very much in the class, in the thing, remember, I will send, I'll do an announcement, but no class on Wednesday, do your midterm 2, have a good spring break, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. And don't be stressed.
2 weeks.
Spring break, guys, don't come to class next week.
Is that PowerPoint gonna be available on Canvas as well?
What'd you say, Mark?
Is this PowerPoint that you just showed us, the stress in times of COVID, is that available on Canvas?
I think it is. I know it's visible. Could you shoot me an email if it's not, and I'll do it later. I have to go teach now, and in case I forget, if you don't see it, just shoot me an email.
Alrighty, thank you.
Okay.